Good morning and welcome to SURF's Place and Practice Network. My name is Ewan Leach. I'm the Chief Executive of SURF. It's good to see you all this morning on what is maybe a bit of a dreary day. It's dreary in Edinburgh. Well, it's sort of dreary in Edinburgh. It's not quite raining. Not as bad as yesterday. I was over in Girvan yesterday and it thrashed rain all day. Both on my journey over and back. So yes, thank you very much for joining us this morning, and the session is being recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube later today. So today, I think you know the format that this takes. We have two presentations this morning. We'll have a break at 10:55 to 11:10. And the purpose of this morning is to have a look at two quite different projects around the application of Scotland's place policies. To begin with, we're looking at living locally in Stewarton with Gillian Black from Architecture and Design Scotland and Karen Purvis from East Ayrshire Council. I've been harassing Gillian for months trying to get this event together because I was really interested in the work that Architecture and Design Scotland had done with East Ayrshire Council, looking at one settlement as a whole place and around how you make a series of coherent decisions. And I suppose it's in some ways the sort of practical application of both the place principle and 20-minute neighbourhoods, as well as a whole other bunch of climate change agendas, and how you actually kind of do that where you have existing settlements. It's maybe easier when you have, or if you're building from scratch, but we know that that's a very rare occurrence. So I've invited Gillian and Karen to share with us their experience of what that's been like working together in one particular place. And then after our break, I invited Maria De La Torre and Gordon MacDonald from Knocknagael Allotments Association to come and speak to us, because there was a recent press release around the fact that they had successfully or are in the process of succeeding around community asset transfer of a field for future use as allotments and growing spaces. It's obviously early stages, but it's been maybe a bit of a challenging process for this to proceed, and it's a piece of land that's owned by Scottish Government. And we thought it would be interesting to hear their experience of both the asset transfer process and the challenges around that, and then also to find out what their plans are for the field, because it ties into, I suppose, previous work that we've been doing, or recent work we've been doing with having a conference on community food growing, and this looks like another excellent example of what sort of form that could take. It's a site up on the edge of Inverness. So that's our plan for this morning. And so I will now hand over to Gillian and Karen and look forward to hearing about the work that you've both done in Stewarton.
Thank you. I'll just share the presentation in 2 seconds. Is it doing it? I can't see.
It is
not yet.
Not quite. Yeah,
there we go, Cam.
That's it, doing it now.
That's it. That's great. Thanks, Ewan. Hi, everyone. My name is Gillian Black and I work for Architecture and Design Scotland. This is going to be a joint presentation with the most fabulous Karen Purvis from East Ayrshire Council. She's been fundamental in the work that we've been doing. She's shown a lot of leadership in what we're doing. So without Karen, we wouldn't have been able to do any of this stuff. So it's a joint presentation. So just next slide, please. That's great. So regards to ANDS, I was saying my name is Gillian Black. I'm a Principal Urban Designer and City Planner, and I've got over 30 years experience working in the built environment, with the majority of work being focused on the kind of public sector and how places are shaped through kind of placemaking and engagement. And I lead a team that provides planning and design advice to all the local authorities across Scotland to create place-based outcomes. So I work with the rest of the key agencies and other partners to create large-scale collaborations and how to interpret national policy to a local and sub-regional context and take place-based outcomes and shared approaches. So I want to use this presentation to introduce some of the work that we've done within ANDS and other key agencies. And the topic is really around local living and the collaboration we've done with East Ayrshire Council. So a lot of you will probably know Architecture Design Scotland. We're the country's design champion. We're funded by the Scottish Government, and we're focused on helping agencies and local authorities to build and design built environments to create good places for everyone. So if we just go to the next slide, Karen, please. So I always use this slide, why place is important when we talk about livability. So for the next slide, please. We know that placemaking is relevant and important to livability. We know that placemaking is a process of creating good quality places. It concerns the environment in which we live, the people that inhabit these spaces, and the quality of life that comes from interaction of people and places in their surroundings. And placemaking is dependent on a collaborative approach that involves design and development of places over time with people and communities, and that's central to the process. But making change happen at scale is very complicated and it's very, very difficult. You go for the next slide, please, Karen. So to make change happen, we need to know how to deconstruct the concept of a place and understand its story. And to help us do that, we need to understand its streets and spaces as three-dimensional. Now, each zone will have a variety of responsible governing players that play an important influential role in how that street or space is experienced by the user. So what do I mean by that when I say things? Next one, please, Karen. So your experience as a place is shaped by a number of social, economic and environmental individual factors. This could range from your age, your mobility, your personal circumstances to legislative conditions such as the planning policies that determine what uses can happen in the space or building and how that space or building will look. There's guidance on what type street lights, public benches, if trees can be planted or not, what type of bins are provided, how often the streets get cleaned. There's regulations on traffic movements, the amount of traffic, car parking, location of bus stops, size of pavements, widths of roads. There's guidance on operational aspects of social activities such as events. And there's investment decisions around social enterprise, innovation, health and healthcare. And that's just what happens above ground. So there's organisations and many agencies who are responsible to deal with a range of underground facilities, obviously in terms of utilities. So your experience of a place is also shaped by antisocial behaviour patterns and environmental influences such as localised flooding and feelings of safety. And together, these all have a fundamental effect about how you feel, and how you feel will determine what you want to do there. You may want to stay longer in a place, or indeed you may actually want to leave. But there's significant health, climate and social economic challenges that we all face in our cities, towns and neighbourhoods, and addressing the root causes of that is something that we need to do, and it's fundamental to place and placemaking. But tackling these complex place issues is that we need to work together much better than we do just now, and which again is just not easy to do. So next slide, please, for me, Cam. So the impact of COVID raised fundamental questions for us all about how we live in the communities and how much we relied on each other. Amongst the questions were questions about how resilient our places are that we're living and what kind of places are we creating. The place principle was introduced by the Scottish Government in 2018 to help overcome organisational sectorial boundaries to encourage better collaboration, community involvement, and it's hoped that this will improve the impact of our combined energy, resources and investment. Now, the place principle encourages all those responsible for providing services and looking after assets to work and plan together with local communities, and it's a real opportunity to become much more than the sum of its parts by generating novel approaches and bringing the important resources and tackling the root causes head on. Go to the next one, please, Karen. So place and placemaking is not only extremely important, it's also useful in a reliable way to understand and implement complex changes that we see in our communities. It's important to bridge between national policies and local action on the ground. Place is already at the forefront of much of our national policy agendas. It plays a key role in government priorities and infrastructure investment, public health, climate action and planning policies. And these high-level policy agendas do need to be reflected on the ground in terms of circumstances of people's everyday life to affect real change. So if we can just pick up on a couple of little bits of that. So if we're going to the next one, Karen. So Scotland is committed to reducing emissions and leading net zero by 2045, and transport in Scotland's biggest contributor to climate change emits over a quarter of all the greenhouse gas emissions. With this, the largest share of transport emissions comes from cars, accounting to 38%. The predominance of private cars, therefore, cannot be overlooked when considering place is being looked at. And the frequency of car use can be reduced by improving local livability, improving access to facilities, helping to reduce emissions and pollution. So much more about walking, cycling, getting access to different places to make it much more easier for people to every day to get about. The next slide, please. National Transport Strategy for Scotland says it will continue to create a planning system that puts in place options that will discourage people from owning or using cars. It also states that the benefits of placemaking and sustainable active travel infrastructure will also play an important role in helping to revitalise town centres. The update to the climate change plan for Scotland also commits to reducing the car kilometres by 20% by 2030. This is seen as a truly world-leading aspiration, and we're not aware of other country that is looking to take such ambitious transformations. And just for the next slide, Karen. The route map for a healthier, fairer and greener Scotland, this S-shaped illustration, includes a list of year-by-year selected investment in legislative interventions, which comprise of the journey to reduce car kilometres by 2030. Interventions range from free bikes for school children, investment in bus and rail network, low emission zones and improvement in digital infrastructure. Just the next one. So if I can now turn to public health, despite tremendous progress in life expectancy, it's not acceptable that our health is poorer than other parts of Europe, and it's not acceptable that people in Scotland are not able to thrive. While life expectancy is increasing overall, there's significant differences in life expectancy and health of people across Scotland, and depending on factors such as where they live, their age and their gender and their ethnic group, deprivation has a large impact on health life expectancy. The impact of these variations in health at the same time as population is ageing is wide-reaching. More people in Scotland are now living with one or more health conditions. They require more health and social care, and that requirement will increase as they age. Fewer people are now able to work and remain in work as a result of health problems or because of requirement to care for a loved one who is also unwell. Just go to the next one. Adults should aim for around 20 to 30 minutes moderate physical activity, such as brisk walking and as a daily minimum. But research is showing that only around a quarter of children in all age groups between 5 and 15 do not meet physical activity guidelines over the average week, and this is starting to decline with age. So only nearly a quarter of children travel to school by car. I'll just go to the next slide. So the key agencies group, they came together in 2020 in August to offer all local authorities an opportunity to develop a much more collaborative and whole place collaborative approach to establishing early engagement in the planning system. These are the key agencies. You can see the logos are here, and the group of bodies that are recognised as supporting the delivery of this radical change through improved joint working to help implement the place principle. And it's hoped by coming together with local authorities, we can combine our wealth of expertise and knowledge of a place to help make change happen, help deliver value for money through the alignment of our combined resources and funding opportunities. The next one, Karen. We've been working closely with several local authorities across Scotland, helping them to start to take radical change needed to take on a more place-based collaborative approach. So worked initially with the Green Recovery, just as COVID happened, was 11 local authorities. There was many workshops and many scoping meetings to kind of figure things out. The next slide, Karen. We tend to work with local authorities in 3 different scales. So the local authority scale, so undertaking strategic planning through local development plans, a town scale, which is the work we're talking about to do with Stewarton to help with established town and city plans, and the neighbourhood scale to establish neighbourhood master plans. And just a final slide from that one there. So we often begin by asking people to talk and share what remit, roles and responsibilities they all have in a place and what that means on the ground. So why is change needed? Why do things need to change? What change will make a difference? And taking a place-based approach involves dealing with complexity. It recognises that to achieve real change demands taking on more than one thing at a time. Departments all have their own policies, or strategy objectives, resources and constraints and skills. So by positioning support and the workshops that we're doing with Stewarton as part of the kind of route map to a system of change, we can start to help people to see the value of collaboration. And the next slide is for over to then Karen. Karen will talk about the compact, the work we'll be doing within Stewarton.
Yep, so as Gillian says, they're working at 3 scales, and Stewarton falls into the kind of town scale. It's a town in East Ayrshire. It's close to Kilmarnock. It's about 30 minutes south of Glasgow. In many ways, I think it's a really successful place. It's growing. A lot of people want to live there. You know, there are areas of Ayrshire where we don't see that. But with those strengths as an area, there come a number of challenges, and over a number of years, the council has received a lot of kind of complaints and representations, a lot of them through the local development plan process, where people are worried about future growth and the impact that's having on services and infrastructure which are perceived to be under strain. One of our statutory responsibilities, I think most people in this room will have an awareness of the planning process, is to prepare the local development plan, which essentially sets out the land use framework for a local authority. And that, as kind of Gillian's talked about a wee bit, has a big role in climate change and creating healthy, sustainable and resilient places that are fair to everyone. And we can't do that without addressing climate change mitigation and adaptation. And so planning, obviously there's a number of ways that I can help to do that through the LDP, including looking at the location, scale, mix and character of development to ensure that works well in terms of addressing climate change. So obviously today we're talking about 20-minute neighbourhoods and how they maybe play a role in that. When we started doing this work on Stewarton, national policy was kind of a bit of a state of flux in terms of planning. We had the emergence of draft National Planning Framework 4 at the time, which brought to the fore this concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods. And there has kind of, obviously for a long time been aspects of that, in terms of designing places and walkability, livability, etc. But this obviously talks about us meeting people's needs, most of people's needs every day, by a pleasant 20-minute return walk. And so the emergence of this allowed us, alongside the key agencies, to consider Stewarton as a pilot exercise in how to retrofit a 20-minute neighbourhood into a rural town. So how do you do that? And we are talking about retrofitting, and I think that's a really important point, because quite often when we talk about national policy or when it comes out, it's very idealistic. The reality is that you're not in a situation where there's nothing on the ground and you can make a nice wee 20-minute neighbourhood. It doesn't work like that. It will never work like that. So you've got to do the best with what you've got. And that's not always very easy. So Gillian's going to talk a bit more later on about the kind of detail of what we've done together and some of the key tasks, but I'm going to give you a kind of overview of maybe some of the more strategic issues that we were facing. I think kind of why did we pick Stewarton? Well, essentially because it was a pressing issue for us in terms of the community and politically, due to the level of growth it experienced versus its scale and infrastructure. And kind of as the housing allocations of the current outgoing local development plan have been built out, those concerns relating to infrastructure have just intensified. And so at the outset, when we were starting the new local development plan, issues with services, infrastructure and capacity of Stewarton were identified as the main issue in the main issues report. So we're talking about the outgoing planning system rather than the incoming one. And that sets out the big topics that plan is required to address. So in Stewarton, we had issues coming out of our ears, problems with NHS, doctors, dentists, education in terms of capacity at certain stages of preschool, primary school, secondary school, the subjects people could study, water and wastewater, transport infrastructure, both on the road into the town and in terms of the kind of main junction within the town. And kind of the scale and the breadth of that is really, really difficult to unpick. But we made a commitment through the main issues report that we would work with stakeholders, including the community, to identify a sustainable approach to future development, and that we would prepare a long-term strategy for the town. So I suppose the process of attempting to retrofit 20-minute neighbourhood is kind of, I guess, the same as any sort of project management process. But I think one of the most important things that we did, so I'm going to actually go back to this one, one of the most important things we did was to really take our time to kind of analyse and understand what the baseline and the status quo was. And there was a lot of questions in there, like the community are telling us infrastructure is struggling. That's not unusual in planning. You get that all the time through any LDP. But is it, or is that just a perception? And which bits are struggling and why? What plans have different agencies and different parts of the council and other parties got in place to address these issues? Are they short term, medium term, long term? And how does the situation in Stewarton compare locally and nationally? And riding on Austin Smith Lord helping us do this. And this was the kind of the first time that a real proper full factual baseline had been considered across all service providers and users simultaneously. And we published that, and that was then the first time that the residents and the kind of people with interest in Stewarton could actually really see all of this gathered together in one place and kind of being really transparent about it. And that helped us to build a kind of cumulative picture and a strategic picture that you just can't achieve by working in silo. And it starts to reveal a lot of interdependencies that you're not aware of. And I think kind of that's the crux of starting to get this right, that you need to understand the issues strategically and cumulatively, and to find solutions which enhance the place and experience for people using it, and critically that don't trigger other problems, because sometimes you fix one thing, you mess something else up. Some of the problems were more perceived than real, I think that's fair to say, and some of the problems had short-term solutions which would address imminent capacity concerns, but that kind of long-term strategic vision was missing, so those problems were going to end up kind of coming back or rumbling on. And I think really like being able to sort of validate residents' perceptions or kind of explain why they weren't correct, and sharing that information was really important in building kind of community trust and engaging people, and in showing and kind of proving that the council understand the issues that the place is actually facing. And that then obviously helps to start inform the next stage of what we do to address that. So in Stewarton, we've undertaken 4 community and elected member events, and we've been assisted by consultants on some of them and representatives of the government key agencies and Architecture and Design Scotland on others. And we held those like really early at the kind of evidence gathering and option identification stages. And we held further events just with our elected members. And it's really, really key to get the right people around the table. This applies to both other local agencies, national agencies, politicians, the local communities, but also within the council itself. Kind of sometimes in planning you get seen as the people that need to fix the LDP and sort it out, but you can't do that without education on board. You can't do that without the health social care partnership on board. Otherwise it just doesn't work. And if MD's missing, you'll not get a complete picture. And what you also get through that is a kind of shared vision and collaborative stewardship of the actions that come out of it. You start to see things, people start to realise why things the way they are. So why do we need to provide housing? Well, here I'll tell you, I've got a maths learner to meet, and I need to provide X number of houses across the local authority area, so there's not a lot I can do about that. And then they start to kind of reframe how they feel about things and kind of accept things to a certain degree, and then kind of work with them. Constraints, so many constraints in this process. I've talked to some of them. So in terms of timing, how everything falls into place is really difficult. We, for instance, were in a situation where planning legislation was changing all around us. We had to, whether we liked it or not, whether we were ready or not, have a plan and strategy in place by May 2022, which was when the transitional period for development planning started. And so if we hadn't got the plan issued by that point, we would have had to start all over again. So yeah, that I think possibly, some things might have been easier if we'd had a wee bit longer. I've talked about this a wee bit already. What's on the ground is a big constraint, and this kind of utopia of creating a 20-minute neighbourhood, I don't know that that exists, certainly in East Ayrshire. There's already the situation on the ground. We had, as a council, no land, other than land already occupied by the school estate and leisure facility. The leisure facility being very new and having had tens of millions of pounds spent on it to actually try and unlock some of these problems and provide space for new facilities that were needed. Otherwise, obviously, everything needs to go around the edge of the settlement. So what do you do? And I think you just do the best you can. And I'll talk in a wee minute about what we did do. And I think, that's not ideal, but using that kind of 20-minute neighbourhood as a kind of guiding star and getting it as close as you can to it, I think for a lot of us is kind of the compromise that we probably need to reach, at least in the short to medium term. Definitions of, I suppose this is probably the legislation box, definitions of long-term planning. One of the things that really opened my eyes was that definitions of how people work long-term are very different across different policy areas. In planning, we work to 10 to 20 years. Education are working to 5. You know, in terms of like what their school estate looks like, that's really, really difficult because they're not in a frame of mind or in a financial position or, you know, to actually be thinking about 10 to 20 years ahead. And kind of navigating through that and working with all these different policy frameworks is really complex. How do you align that? I don't know, but I think a starting point is to get a grasp corporately of how all your strategic plans interact with each other and reassess, if possible, when they're being reviewed to allow you better alignment or at least better feeding. Politically, you know, there's obviously a lot of political interest. There are tensions between what national policies saying and kind of national politics are saying, and how elected members and others feel differently, and the pressures on the elected members from their communities as well. And I think the evidence and kind of explaining why you need to do certain things helps to diffuse some of that to a certain extent. Evidence you need. Sometimes the evidence I need from someone to do my job is not the evidence that they need to do their job. So they've never looked for it. They don't care. But it's really critical to understand how well something will or won't work, and trying to foster that shared understanding of why it's needed, and kind of critically for them to understand what's in it for them. You know, if they help give you this information, how is that going to help them later on to you know, make their service better. But when everyone's together, you kind of start to see moments of understanding. One for me was that I hadn't realised that where Stewarton was and the capacity of Stewarton in terms of the high school meant that the way the school was being used, there were certain, now I'm going to show my age here because I don't know what they're called now, but there were certain hires that children couldn't do, pupils couldn't do because the timetabling didn't work and it was too far on the bus for them to go to another town to get the education in a particular subject and then to be able to come back to school and fit in their other subjects. So actually that dictates then the destinations of people. So place and how well that place works affects economic growth. We know that anyway, but actually the destinations of where our young people are going to end up in terms of employment. And if you kind of really follow that line of thinking through, it's quite interesting because that's affecting skill shortages in your area, how well your area is going to work. Talk a wee bit about capacity. I don't want to fill everybody with pessimism, but this is not a small undertaking. We had consultants working on this, kind of mostly the evidence baseline for about 10 months, sorry. Key agencies group, we're obviously putting in a lot of time to this. That's one town. In many ways, it's our most complicated town, but we've got about 30 of these. So that's a kind of frightening thought. But what I would say is that we and key agencies, particularly Architecture and Design Scotland, very, very hot on recording what emerging practice is. And I think every time somebody goes through this kind of exercise, there starts to become kind of emerging best practice, records of process, reflections, ways people can do things better. And I think this is kind of like Architecture and Design Scotland in particular, loads of great resources for examples of practice and emerging practice. And, you know, leading really by example in that, and that starts to make things easier for people down the road because people have already been through this. So you're kind of not trying to reinvent the wheel, certainly in terms of processes. So kind of getting back to where we got to with Stewarton, and I've talked, you know, this is not a utopia. We've got a very dense town. We're kind of quite landlocked in terms of what we can do with it. We got to a point, can you see my pointer? Just, yeah.
Yes.
So this, what we eventually did was we allocated one site for housing out here, just one. Previously we did quite a lot. Capacity of around about 300 units, I think. But as part of that, half of the site, so sort of this kind of eastern portion of the site, has to be given over to us as land for a new kind of school or kind of part of the education estate, whether that's preschool, primary school, etc. By doing that, eventually we free up this wee site in here, which then allows a site much nearer the centre of Stewarton to have on it a mixture of healthcare uses and assisted living accommodation, and kind of there's sort of I feel like a domino effect from there, which starts to unlock some of the issues that we've got. I can't really in the time we've got like do justice to everything there was, but kind of that's the essence of it, and also coming up with a developer contribution framework which would allow some funding for the required infrastructure. I'm kind of conscious of time. How long have we got, Ewan? Are we?
We're at 10:30.
Right. So I'll maybe I think I've kind of talked I'll quite a lot kind of through what I've said about the kind of outputs and outcomes to date. So I'll maybe fire back to Gillian and let her zoom through the rest. Sorry, Gillian.
No, that's fine, Karen. Okay. Yeah, so leading on the stuff that Karen had talked about, I'm just going to go through some of the work we've done with the key agencies. So we started off with a cross-departmental, cross-agency workshop that really kind of thrashed out all the issues that were happening from the communities and the agencies and departments concerns. That produced a series of recommendations that we agreed on. The local authority and the key agencies agreed that ANDS would take forward recommendation 2. And that was to look at the proposed housing site that Karen had identified there that would potentially be released for housing, to see how the concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods could be adopted within the kind of Stewarton. And also recommendation 4, looking at the health and learning estates, because we knew that that was something that was being an issue that was constantly emerging. So for the next slide, Karen. So at this time, the local living 20-minute neighbourhood policies draft guidance wasn't produced, and we were keen to use the work that we're doing in Stewarton to build on the recommendations that we're seeing already from an academic point of view. So the key reports that we're referencing at that time was the Climate Exchange and 20-minute neighbourhoods in a Scottish context, and that provided a bit of a framework to consider and build on what was the 20-minute neighbourhood, and also there was the 14 features that was outlined in that framework. So it was helping us to get a bit of a feel for what was the concepts of 20-minute neighbourhoods at that time. We go to the next slide, Karen. We also wanted to look at, so these 3 diagrams outlined in the report helped inform the approach that we took. The 3 themes were the 20-minute neighbourhoods, that one there in terms of 20-minute neighbourhoods, the first one, and then there's a place in wellbeing outcomes, which was fundamentally important, and also the 14 categories of what a 20-minute neighbourhood looks like in a Scottish context. So these were the tools that we were using at our disposal at that time. We just go to the next slide. So NPF4 at that time was in draft, but we could see now that one of the spatial priorities in the approved NPF4 was local living, and some of the policy outcomes are shown are here. It was focusing now, we can see it's to improve community health and wellbeing, create a network of high quality, accessible mixed-use neighbourhoods. New and existing communities are planned together with homes and key local infrastructure, including schools, community centres, local shops, green space, health and social care, digital and sustainable transport links. So if we go to the next one. So again, it was to applying a place-led approach. We wanted to understand the human scale, that aspect of living and experiencing Stewarton. We wanted to feel what the human experience was like. We wanted to be informed by the qualitative and quantitative information from the framework, those diagrams that we're talking about, and primarily using data as evidence. So for the next slide. So we wanted to develop a relationship about how to do that. So we discussed it with Scottish Government Digital Planning team, and they'd helped us set up a 20-minute neighbourhood mapper that was going to be able to be GIS based, and allowed us to gather a lot of the intel across agencies, across departments, of providing a kind of a baseline understanding of as much data as possible to understand what would be 20 minutes within this area. So we used, as I said, GIS to start to map everything, and also use isochrones to understand the kind of distance thresholds, but everything again would be taken from the bird's eye view as a crow flies, rather than an experiential nature. So it was allowing us to use a bit of data to kind of understand and explore the place. So for the next slide. So mapping the baseline information was helpful, especially having associated the distances, as I was saying, where people could get to easily to access services. However, the Climate Exchange report recommended that you need to understand the quality of information. So we need to understand that user experience. So we know that the experience is informed by physical space, which then helps to regulate what policy is about. So we need to take a much more finer grain approach to understanding Stewarton. So for the next slide, Karen. So we took a deep dive into Stewarton's places, identified the character areas with input from the council. This was undertaken at that time when we'd done a kind of desktop analysis. Normally we would do all that type of stuff on site. We started to understand kind of character areas and really kind of formulating an understanding of the finer grain approaches of what is the spaces, the places, and that three-dimensional aspect that I talked about earlier of what is making up Stewarton. We could actually see what was happening there. The next slide. We got the mapping, now we got some data and we had to analyse it, but it was really important that we spoke to the local community. So we've done a place standard exercise using the latest, that is actually used as a test pilot for the climate lens version that is produced. And also we've done a living local survey. So if you go to the next slide, Karen. So at that time, New Zealand were actually doing something on 20-minute neighbourhoods, and they were doing a very similar type of exercise where they're speaking to the local community groups. So there was information such as a living local survey that we done with the local community within Stewarton, with the local authority, to ask people how they felt Stewarton was performing in terms of a place regarding experiential nature. So that would build on the work that we've done with the climate lens version of the place standard, and also the living locally information. To the next one then, Karen. So all the intel from the place standards, the climate lens, the living local survey, the digital mapping work helped us in the council to see how this way of understanding Stewarton as a 20-minute neighbourhood could help shape the decision-making process. And as Karen said, they appointed consultants to take forward a lot of the information. So we knew that there was a development framework, and that had a placemaking map to start to identify a series of actions to improve the connectivity, movement, experiential nature of Stewarton. There's potentially something to do with the site briefs. They needed to take a much more finer grained approach to understanding what the sites should be and why. And there was an issue to do with the facilities. So the council to take an infrastructure first approach to coordinate conversations with wider stakeholders, as Karen had talked about, having everyone round the table to make the decisions, so that local decisions that are affecting community groups are not done just in isolation by one department at a time. Next slide, Karen. So again, we applied that whole place approach using the placemaking actions, exploring and testing them using the digital mapping platform to see where we should start to intervene and why, where were the best place to start to do things. And these were two indicating factors we wanted to address, which was nature and the climate crisis. So if we just go into the next one. So when we start to do this, what we're starting now is looking at the school estate. So around that aspect is about education. We need planning at the table, we need roads, community planning and the climate team, and we want to think about the footprint of the building. So there's an awful lot of grey. How do we get grey to green? We also need to understand how the street performs as a place. Is this the right location for the school? What's the plans that the school have got for the school estate so that exists in a future capacity? So we need to understand the numbers, the impact that school is going to have over a certain length of time. We need to understand the condition of the school over that certain length of time, and we need to establish a kind of baseline. So this is the kind of workings of a workshop that we're starting to develop with the local authority. Again, trying to explore the aspect of just schools as a concept and the impact of any changes that the school estates are going to have. So if the next slide can. So again, we're going to be wanting to use the mapping information, the information from the climate lens place standard, from the survey, from the placemaking map, all at the one time trying to understand what is happening. So we need to think about the user of the people from the school, we need to think about walkability, we need to think about the wider implications to the placemaking map. We need to also understand what the other strategies and investment decisions the other parts of the local authority are looking to do. And we need to just try and drill down much more tighter to understand, to help make the decisions going forward. So for my, I guess, second last slide. So for the kind of emerging findings, is that you need to look for data, the right data at the right time in the right ways. You need to use as much data streams and help unlock silos to develop insights and feed innovation in place. And whether it's structured or semi-structured, unstructured data will come in lots of many sources, but you need to put that together to get a holistic view of place. And this really needs to be as part of engagement with communities and stakeholders, because they're the ones that actually are affected by it. And you need to use that evidence and data and analytical skills for innovation to understand what needs to change and why, and to help inform decisions and to align resources, to align outcomes as well within council departments and agencies. And then my final slide is that people in place are the most important factors when we're talking about livability, because all this is Karen saying that it actually affects people and what they're actually going to do with their life. So if I hand you back, Karen.
Yeah, I think I'll probably just to save the timetable, I think I've probably given you most of my pearls of wisdom, so we can maybe just move to questions and I'll stop sharing.
Thanks very much, Karen. And Gillian, that was a whistle-stop tour around what you've been doing in Stewarton. And I suppose one of the final things that struck me about that was your focus on the school, the importance of the school within the settlement. And I suppose we've had, well, about a year ago, Aberdeenshire's academy school approach, a sort of academy town approach, and using those as their kind of understanding of how you apply the local living concept across a sort of a wider area like Aberdeenshire. So interesting to see that happening there. And also important for you to be using data and qualitative experience, because I suppose that's what we've been sort of data we've been gathering. And I think Living Streets presentation in particular talked about, if it's not a nice place to be, who cares if it's 20 minutes and you're not going to choose to walk or wheel or cycle along a route. If anyone's got any questions, put your hand up, or you can put questions in the chat. I suppose, Karen, I had a question for you around what ANDS brought. Was it, because I suppose one of the things you talked about was like your internal capacity within the local authority, working with a key ANDS and key agency, was it that additional capacity that they brought to the table that allowed you to their analysis was really what they brought to East Ayrshire?
They brought that, but I think more than that, they pushed us to do better. I would say, like, you're always running against a timeline planning, whether people think you are or not. And we were kind of very much up against it. But I think what Gillian kind of our team were really good at was saying, right, well, hang on a minute, is that actually the best thing you could do? What if you did that? What if you did that? Have you thought about this? And I would say, yeah, I have, but I've got this problem, that problem, the next problem, and then we would start to kind of really work through it. And so it was kind of having that, I suppose, person to kind of sit on your shoulder and go, no, there's actually something better you can do here, and here's how I can help you do it, and here's how you can sell it. So it was much more than capacity, it was making me do better, I would say.
Okay. Good to hear. Obviously a challenge for you as well. I suppose, what would you say, your initial analysis of Stewarton, what decisions are you making about Stewarton now that are different to what you'd initially maybe thought?
Well, I suppose so. One of the issues we maybe have right now, one of the things Gillian and I are trying to kind of battle through, is that obviously we're in a position where the LEAP funding for schools still hasn't been announced. We don't know what's going to happen, like increasing budget pressures on councils. So I think part of what we're doing is, like a lot of the time you write a plan and then you go, right, I've written it, that's it. And obviously kind of this idea of delivery programs that the government are bringing in, and we've had action programs, but kind of this more of a focus on delivery. I think what's different is that we've really not stopped. Like there's not been a pause since that proposed plan was published. We're working on things with the education estate. We've not had the time to talk about it, but we're working on a street tree project as well, kind of at the other scale of things in Stewarton. So it's very much that I've been trying to be a bit agile about I suppose the framework, and like what can I do right now, how can I set this up, how can I suppose preserve the bigger ambitions of it, whilst in the context of constraints which continually change around about you. You know, you make a plan at a certain point of time, but time doesn't stop. Your plan does, if you like. So that's the kind of fixed thing you've got for 5 years, soon it'll be 10 years. But the world changes round about you. So how do you keep trying to achieve, I suppose, the outcomes you were trying to achieve? I've rambled there.
No, let's not ramble. Thanks very much. Nick, Marshall, you have a question for our speakers. If you want to say where you're coming from in your introduction.
Yeah, I'm with the Community Council, the Northfield and Willoughby Community Council in Edinburgh. You were at a very early stage in this, and I would have to say that we're a little bit innocent of the detail and how this works. But I just wanted to ask you a rather daft laddie question. There doesn't seem to be any consensus on a definition of 20-minute neighbourhoods, and I'm interested that in your definition right at the beginning that you were saying a 20-minute round trip by foot is the definition that you've used, and that's much smaller than the areas that we're talking about in Edinburgh. And I'm wondering whether that's a definition that was that you've taken from elsewhere, or what you've decided because it works with Stewarton.
No, so that's the kind of government definition. But interestingly, I was doing kind of a similar version of this talk yesterday at the APSI conference, and the kind of chief architect from the Scottish Government was there, and what he was saying is the kind of feedback they've received is that the kind of idea of the 20-minute neighbourhood, the 10-minute there, the 10-minute back, is actually, people are quite confused by it. And I think really, like, if we pair it back to the essence of what this is about people being able to meet their kind of daily needs within you know, a kind of shortish distance. So it's about living locally. I think to get too kind of pinned down on the 10 minutes is probably not particularly helpful, and I think we may well see them take a bit of a step back from that. Certainly, there was another local authority there yesterday who kind of asked a similar-ish question, and said that you know, there's been, you know, you'll be aware maybe that there has been a kind of movement kind of against 20-minute neighbourhoods, and that concept is all about people understanding it as us as kind of authorities trying to restrict movement, which is absolutely not what it's about. It's about making sure that people can, you know, that people don't have to go really far to do what they want to do on a day-to-day basis. You know, so I don't know if that helps, but I think that the idea of 20 minutes is less important than the idea that people can meet their needs fairly locally. That would be my input.
I'd say that mirrors. I mean, I suppose, Nick, one of the interesting things that when we began, this network began as the 20-minute neighbourhood network as a policy focus. Before we began it, we asked people questions about what they thought about it. And there was, what our survey of people who joined the network revealed was that in particular men were fixated on the definition of 10 or 20 minute and what that meant. But there was also a feeling of, it's not about that. That's a sort of guideline figure, and it's about how easy and, importantly, as Karen said, how pleasant it is to access your daily needs in a climate friendly way, or in an active way. And through the past 2 years, I suppose that has been the continued kind of messaging. It's about how easy it is for us to make choices on a daily basis that are good for us and good for the planet, and actually good for our economy. And that's the kind of focus of it. The 20-minute is this kind of, began as a snappy catchphrase to make people think about that. Obviously, it's been slightly hijacked, more than slightly. It's become dominated by another kind of topic around it, which is, but I would say in reading this, if anything you read in the Scottish planning policy around this, is it's not prescriptive. It is make your places as good as possible, using these kind of policy guidelines. Karen, I don't know if, sorry, Gillian, I don't know if you had anything else to add to that.
No, I think it's just a case of understanding place from the people that are using it, and to just see how we can actually make it better. So, you know, I think a lot of it's to try and see how do we encourage people that they want to walk. Can they walk to the shops if they wanted to? Could they take a bike if they wanted to? Is it safe? Does it feel that they've got access to green spaces? Do they feel they've got access to, could they buy a pint of milk without having to jump in the car? It's just really trying to understand, you know, how do people themselves feel, what is provided for them in that local community, and is it a walkable place?
Thanks very much. And I just Ian McCall for Pastoral saying that the attitude survey reveals that 7 in 10 support the 20-minute concept, only 5% strongly oppose it. But we know the 5% are the ones that are like the noisiest ones. And I think a lot of the noise just now is particularly around traffic monitoring, seems to be where there's significant resistance. Judy Wilkinson has a question. She's asking, how do you involve local people in getting information that you're collecting? Placemaking maps are often difficult to access. And sorry, I've got something that's popped up and I can't read it fully. And the link are very complex. Do you unpick these so they're accessible to non-professionals? So when you were using the Place Standard and the other tools, particularly the new one, the Climate Lens one, how did you find using that with the public?
Yeah, well, we went through the community council and worked with Karen to do that, and basically done a kind of online Miro board kind of exercise to find out, you know, what they kind of felt, really got an opportunity to ask the community groups, you know, tell me more about how this place is functioning. So we could use the Place Standard as a methodology to ask a series of questions, and then bring out ideas about mitigation and adaptation. This is where the concept of, where we could hear that the community groups were talking about the like to plant street trees. So that was another thing, right? Okay, street trees, that's a good thing we want to do, the community groups are wanting to do. We know that would help with surface water management, it help with improving the experience of how a street can perform, and including local biodiversity. The survey was done through the consultation hub, I think, through the local authority as well. So that was open again to everyone, like any other kind of public consultation through the actual local authorities consultation hub. So again, through that, we could then see and analyse what the general population were feeling in Stewarton about the changes that they would like to see, and then we could merge that information together and then take that with the data and analysis and put it all together and make sense of it. You know, is it a perceived thing? Yes. Is it true? Yes, we have the data to back it up. So it just allowed us to really get a fine grain approach from the community's perspective.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting comment, because we all know that we're about to go into, well, we started to know the idea of local place plans. So kind of this idea that placemaking maps are kind of difficult to access and the links are complex. Yes, they can be, but we're in a position now, I guess, where communities are going to be at the forefront of taking those forward rather than the local authorities. And I guess what we try and do, we have, and a lot of local authorities do have various people, both community workers and kind of placemaking officers, who help kind of talk communities through that process. So that by the time you've got a map, you know, everybody's sat around the table lots and lots of times and understands what that map is. I say everybody who's been involved in that process, but it's I think we probably will start to see a lot of kind of emerging really good practice around local place plans and trying to make those easier to understand, and communities kind of presenting their own ways of doing it. And then I see you've asked, do you report back at the next stage? Yeah, constantly trying to report back, because if you don't do that, you start to lose like any kind of trust and momentum that you've built up with the community. So it is very much that you have to go back and that you have to keep in touch, and that they have to know that you've not forgotten about it and kind of put it in a box and moved on to something else.
I thought that was an interesting part of your presentation, where you talked about people's perceptions and being able to either have them confirmed with evidence, or being able to say that may be a perception, but is it the reality? Nick Marshall is also asking, how are you assessing monitoring the emissions reductions resulting from implementation of the plan? Do you have plans for long-term monitoring of that?
Yep, it won't be me. We've got kind of climate change officer who does a lot of work around that. I think probably for instance, the street tree project will be something where probably we will start to look at the evidence of how that's helping in terms of various different factors, which might include emissions reductions. I think where we're talking about putting them is kind of on the main sort of thoroughfare in Stewarton, so kind of what impact potentially that's having. But I think kind of the wider point there around monitoring it and making sure it's working. A lot of the time there's a tendency to bring something in and think, right, well, that will fix it, but not actually to keep assessing it and to understand whether that is working or whether you need to then kind of adapt and change what you're doing. I don't think that was 100% an answer because I'm not involved in assessing and monitoring emissions reductions, but it's kind of the best I could probably manage.
But it is a good question because I suppose for those of us who do any retrofit stuff recently, which is often focusing on retrofitting of buildings, you find there's now monitoring them to make sure that the retrofit is working so that you can repeat it because it's worked. And I suppose the same thing does apply to settlements, that if we apply principles and don't monitor what the actual outcomes are around these particular agendas, we need to know that we're actually doing and making it better. Claire Williams asks, what can rural communities do if the local authority has a strategic policy directing all placement and investment to towns?
That question slightly astonishes me because I think, there is probably a tendency for kind of government funding and a lot of funding to end up in towns, but kind of as a local authority, we very much at East Ayrshire have a lot of policies directing things to all of our settlements and kind of quite a lot of projects which cover the rural area. I think so. If I could pick up maybe something with Stewarton, Stewarton, despite it being kind of semi-rural, acts as a hub town for a lot of towns round about it. So there are a lot of wee villages round about Stewarton that are supported by Stewarton. And so when we did the work on Stewarton, we weren't just talking to people in Stewarton. We were talking to people in Dunlop, we were talking to people in Lugton, we were talking to people in Comores, we were talking to people, kind of rurally as well. So that I suppose the advice I would give a rural community would be when you see things happening in towns for which which maybe your village or rurally people rely on, is to get involved in that process and be making the points around, well, this affects us too, because actually I live way out here, but I go to school in that town, so it's important that you consider our links into that school. So we did that, but if you feel that that's not something that's being done where you live, I would say get involved in those, get involved in the placemaking and investment of towns and be making the point that this town actually supports your town and that therefore the links between those towns are important. But it's a shame to think that there are maybe local authorities that aren't directing investment into smaller places. We've got a lot of that. So
yes, you will. In Ayrshire, you have a wide variety of.
So we are kind of like, that is what we need to do. I can appreciate there may be local authorities whereby they have many fewer kind of rural areas, so it's maybe it does end up being less of a focus. But I would just say get involved in the bigger things and make your point.
Gillian, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, that's really it. I think it's just, if people do feel disenfranchised by anything that's happening within their local community and they don't feel things are addressed, is just raise it with the local community, with your local councillor, to just try and raise the issues and have consensus brought to the table, that there's not more than just one voice that are backing this up.
I think the question, I suppose, reflects what we've known as a tension for a long time, and the sort of living well locally, or local living, and 20-minute neighbourhoods, which 20-minute neighbourhoods is an urban kind of concept, and living locally is the wider concept. And I suppose I've just written a piece for the RTPI Scotland, and I suppose one of the points I made, you've made excellently, Karen, about it's the fact that it's all parts of the local authority that need to be involved in delivering these policies. But in a wider sense, public transport is the key to making it, to make rural living more sustainable. And obviously that currently is an incredibly complex landscape across Scotland as to how public transport is delivered. But that that connection with your settlement and where your services are is going to be key for some of those smaller communities to access them in a climate-friendly way. I live near a church, and the church bell has just rung. It is 11 o'clock. So I'm going to draw this session, this part of our morning, to our close. I had other questions for you both, but there's been enough questions coming in from the audience. So thank you very much to Gillian and Karen for sharing the information that you've learned from working together on Stewarton, and hopefully other local authorities will be looking at it who maybe haven't worked with the key agencies to the extent that East Ayrshire has, and maybe coming to ANDS for work, or coming to you, Karen, to find out more about what the experience is.
Absolutely. If there's any questions left, I'm happy for you to share my details and people can get in touch.
That's smashing it. The presentation, the whole, this will all be online, but the presentations will also be uploaded online so that people have access to them afterwards. So thank you very much. And we'll pause just now for 10 minutes and come back at 11:10 for our next session. So thanks again to Gillian and Karen. So welcome back, everybody. Hope you've had a good coffee. This morning, we're looking at two aspects of how place policy works. We're interested in how it works within local authorities, and I think what we heard from Karen and Gillian is a good example of how complicated it can be, and that policies are often written for one department, but they actually apply across all departments within a local authority or within directorates within the government. And so there's a challenge there into how they actually work in reality and not the utopia of the policy landscape. So we're interested in how they're working at that level, but we're also really interested in working how policies work at a local level. And I suppose the community empowerment agenda is now not new, and it's been delivered across Scotland to varying degrees of success. And the community asset transfer is one aspect of community empowerment. And so our next presentation this morning is from Maria De La Torre and Gordon MacDonald, who have both led on a community asset transfer challenge, let's say, at Knocknagael on the edge of Inverness. So Maria, I will hand over to you and Gordon to tell us about what that process has been like for you.
Hello, everybody. Gordon and I are both directors of Knocknagael Limited. We're going to do a double act like Gillian and Karen. And what we were planning to do is to give you a bit of a background to the story, and then Gordon's going to speak more about the community asset transfer process, and then again I'll say a little bit about the plans for the area. So, and it's quite a good complement to the talk we've had about Stewarton, in the sense that there's a lot of it related as well to placemaking and some of the difficulties that you can have, and in this case really even starting with a blank sheet. So Knocknagael Limited is a company limited by guarantee with the charitable status. We've been set up with the purpose of acquiring the Smiddy Field, which is part of the Knocknagael Bull Farm, which is a stud farm run by Scottish Government. And the idea is to develop the site into a green hub that will include allotments, community growing areas, including a community orchard, outdoor areas for walking and recreation and wildlife, growing space available for community groups, organisations and schools, and then the scope to develop a part of the field into a community supported agriculture project. So the site location, for those of you that don't know Inverness, it's in the edge of town, and you can see a little bit there of where it is. So it's just on the edge of town, really, and it's just to show you a little bit of a map there on the right-hand corner that shows what the field looks like. It is part of a much larger expanse of land run as part of the Bull Farm. And the arrows you can see show some of the connections there are from the sort of existing settlement, existing streets. And also, although it doesn't show as clearly in the picture, there's about a school about 5 minutes away from that site. So it is quite a strategically important field for the site in terms of being one of the few remaining good fields that we have remaining. So it's got a strategic importance for the community. So in terms of the background of the project, in 2013, the fields were identified as surplus to requirements by the Scottish Government, then running the bull farm. That was not just the Smiddy Field, but the field adjacent to it. And they were earmarked for development and housing. So there was quite a lot of strong local opposition to housing development on prime agricultural land. There was a feeling that we were losing quite a lot of farmland and growing awareness of climate change. And also, Inverness has been a city of growing urbanization, really, even within, since then, even stronger. So a community campaign started then to try and gather momentum, and as part of the planning process, the proposal to put the site for housing was rejected by the reporter in the 2015 local development plan. So it was then that the Allotment Association was established to look at the other alternatives, since the field was redundant to the bull farm, and it was an initial feasibility study carried out that identified a demand for allotments. And the project has since changed quite significantly, but it's worth noting that there was, that's when really things started to progress. And in 2018 and 19, we started to work with the Development Trust Association, DTAS, and Highlands Enterprise in terms of developing the organisation, and also a first asset transfer, which it didn't progress. Without that progress, we decided in 2020 that we were needing to, rather than rent the field, we were looking at really a purchase of the site, and Knocknagael Limited was established to take ownership of the site. The Scottish Land Fund Stage 1 funds were secured, and we were able to carry out a tender process to and appoint community enterprise to help us carry out the work that we needed to develop a community consultation, feasibility study, and landscape report. In 2021, contact with RPID was established, and it was later that year we put in our asset transfer request. It is worth noting that since during that timeline, we, as well as progressing the contact, from 2021 onwards, which is contact, which Gordon will be covering in more depth, as well as dealing with the asset transfer request process, which has been quite an engaged process. We have had the development of the new local development plan, and we've been engaging with that process as well as with the asset transfer. And that has been quite a key part of our project as well. And, the interlink between the two things has been quite important. It is worth noting that, the site was, as part of the call for sites, the site was proposed for housing by the Scottish Government. And we sort of engaged and managed for the site to be allocated for community use. It was quite contested between at Highland Council level, whether the site should or not be changed. And currently, that the two fields again are earmarked for both housing and for community use. So, that the local development plan is currently in the process of being assessed by the reporter. In the meantime, we have received the go-ahead for the community asset transfer to progress, which is quite new, good news for us. So I think, a few bits and pieces to mention about the amount of work that has gone into developing the proposals. And it is worth noting when we were appointing community enterprise, we were in the middle of the pandemic, but we were able to do quite a comprehensive community consultation. We got about 390 responses, which we heard from Highland Council, where it was even more than they got for the Highland-wide community growing strategy they've got. So we've had quite a significant level of support, and sort of 98% of those responding were supportive of the project, and we're quite close to the area we ran 2 community engagement events. An outdoor one was really well received, so you can see some of the images there of us carrying out the consultation. Quite a wealth of quite rich information about what people wanted. We also had a large coverage in terms of it, and flyers, posts on Facebook, and stories published in different media. And you know, and there a few snippets of what people felt. This is a very exciting opportunity for Inverness. What Inverness desperately needs is a great time to secure the land for generations to come and really create a strong community project. We have a lot of wildlife that's being pushed out by all the building now more than ever. We need countryside spaces on our doorsteps. So I think those were the you know, some of the feedback that we received, and it is worth noting as well that you know, an important part of our project was evaluating the community need for the project and the community benefits that the project could have, to show that really there was a strong case to carry out a community asset transfer for the project. So just and as part of that feasibility, we sort of developed the ideas of you know, how important, how the project was connecting with national and local strategies. I think there's quite a bit of commonality there with the presentation we heard earlier on. You know, we were looking at the placemaking principle, community empowerment, and sort of health priorities, quite an important part of the project. Climate change, good with the nation and environment strategy, natural health services and needs, and curriculum for excellence for outdoor learning. A strong link as well with the local strategies there, in terms of developing the Highland outcomes improvement plans, Hilton locality plan, and active Highland strategy, and in the Highland Council's community growing strategy. It's now, sorry, I should say now community growing, because it's now approved. We did also do quite a lot of research that community enterprise carried out about the type of population, and the site is accessible. Although it's in a relatively good area, it is accessible for areas that are more deprived within Inverness. And we did identify the other thing that was quite important, that the school is, the site is within 2 miles of about 8 schools, and it's within about 5 to 10 minutes walk for the Inverness Royal Academy and 2 other primary schools. The Inverness Royal Academy runs a nurture group and a rural skills group, so they are quite a keen partner for the project. We have also developed links with other partnerships, third sector organisations like Homelessness Trust and Action for Children, that have users, both in terms of the volunteers and their clients, that would really like to use the site to put in practice, to provide, you know, that develop some of the skills and confidence that they'll need to get on with life. And you know, we are, one of our directors is a GP that is quite keen on developing the social prescribing element. So we do have quite a sort of range of sort of potential beneficiaries for the site, as well as a growing list of people wishing to use allotments. You know, about 156 people express an interest in, because Inverness does have a very limited provision for allotments. But a key part of the site is to provide spaces that would be available to everybody. And you know, we'll look at some of how the site will look at a bit later on, but just to give a little bit of an overview of some of the work that has gone. So I'm now going to move on. We are now going to move into the explaining about a little bit more about the asset transfer process, and you know, some of our experience, which I'm going to leave to Gordon to cover, and then I'll say a little bit more about the plans for the project.
Thank you, Maria. Just a couple of points to be clear of. When I refer to the Scottish Government in this, I'm referring to the organisation, effectively the civil service, the structure, not politically. So, in terms of the process. The asset transfer request was submitted on October 2021. So that means it's now 2 years since the submission of the request to receiving the decision. So it's a long process, it's a hard process. And at times it seems like every time you jump over one hurdle, another 2 or 3 appear ahead. And our current position is that we made an application, we had that application turned down, we made an appeal, and that appeal was successful. The ministerial direction has gone to the ARPID, who are the department responsible for managing the farm. And as with many other stages, one of the factors in all this is timescales. We definitely felt that throughout the process there were tight timescales that we were required to adhere to. The directive that has been issued says that ARPID are to arrange for the transfer of the fields, but there is no deadline for that. So yes, we've had a great decision and we're happy with it, but there's still potentially a lot to do, and we don't know what those timescales will be, because the timeframes, it would appear, apply to us, but not necessarily to the public authority, in this case, the Scottish Government. Early in 2021, we had a Teams meeting with some of the Scottish Government representatives, the ARPID people. Those were primarily the people responsible for management of the farm, plus one individual who represented the Scottish Government Property Division. It was made, I think, as clear as it could have been that A, they didn't want to sell a field, and B, that if they did sell it, they would want to sell it for housing. Now, as far as we are aware, those are the same people who then made up the panel that made the initial decision. So we were putting forward an asset transfer request at that stage, without knowing who would be making the decision, in what time frame they would make it, and on what basis they would make it. We still haven't had any formal confirmation of when they met, what criteria they used. Did they have some form of decision matrix, or had they in fact already decided what the final decision would be long before we actually submitted the transfer request? So there's a general issue there for the Scottish Government and potentially any public authority in receiving an asset transfer request. Who actually makes up the panel, who makes the decision? There was, in our view, there was a clear conflict of interest. The complexity of the reasons given for refusal were part of a clear part of our grounds for making an appeal. At different stages in the written and verbal submissions, they seem to be suggesting that one, our request would threaten the bull hire scheme in entirety. They alternately appeared to suggest that it would increase the running cost of the scheme. And they also seemed to suggest that what they wanted to do was sell the scheme for housing. So there's a clear, there were contradictions within the decision, but the ultimate grounds for refusal was the contention that the field was essential for the running of the bull hire scheme. The introduction of the housing factor and references to best value in the refusal seem to us to be confused, in the sense that best value appeared to imply that what they actually wanted was best price for the field. Best price being obtained by selling the field for housing as opposed to for community use. There appeared to be a lot of confusion at different stages in what the real reason for the refusal was, as opposed to what they actually said. In other words, what was the evidence to confirm or otherwise the idea that the field was essential for the scheme? What was, at one point, they made a claim about the cost of the scheme and therefore the implications for the users of the scheme, which was at no point backed by numbers. So there was we had a whole series of issues about the way the decision was made and the grounds for the decision. We then proceeded to make a request for what's formally called a review. If this had been a public authority, let's say a council, health authority, or whatever, formally the process is known as an appeal. If it's made to the Scottish Government, it's a review. That's to an extent a technicality, depending on who you're talking to, but I'll use the term appeal simply because that's the more understandable version of what it's about. We didn't believe the process had been objective, and we had a variety of concerns about the way that the original decision was made, which were put in the review request to the Scottish Government. Now, thankfully, the review request was made to a different department within the Scottish Government, and from the time the review request was made, we definitely felt that the process was quite different, that it was a lot more objective, a lot fairer, and a lot more reflective of the Community Empowerment Act, which essentially says that if a duly constituted community group has a proposal, a project it wants to take forward, then the public authority that owns the asset has to come up with an alternative proposal, and the process should be one of comparing the public benefits of the two proposals. Whereas the approach of ARPID appeared to be quite simply, we say the field's not available, and that's it. The review process was, well, first of all, the timescales are worth mentioning. Our request for a review was on the 15th of July 2022. The acknowledgement of that request was quick, within 3 days. The appointment of the review panel was on the 13th of November, 30th of November, i.e. 4 months later. And the actual hearing took place 4 months after that. In other words, we had a wait of over 8 months from the time of putting in a review request for a public hearing to take place. Before that, we had a request for a variety of written information, which was submitted to the panel. The panel then visited the field and had along with ourselves and ARPID, had a trip around the field and around the farm so they could see physically the location and absorb some of the information around that. The review itself we certainly felt was conducted in the spirit that we had expected the original decision to be taken, i.e. it seemed to be objective, fair, both parties given all due opportunity to put their case, and questions from the panel, questions also allowed from each party to the other. What it wasn't was a confrontational courtroom type situation. So it was very much one of information gathering rather than sorry, I've lost the word, adversarial type situation. In due course, the panel considered the evidence. We were asked to submit additional evidence. We were asked to comment on each other's evidence. But following the hearing in March, it was September before the decision was finally made public. So it's a long process. And in the meantime, we had ourselves as directors, obviously, an interest in the process. But there's also a need to keep the membership involved. Because this is very much a community project. We have our membership, we have our supporters, and it would be very, very easy for them to lose faith, lose confidence, simply because of the length of time the process takes. And because the time commitments were open, we couldn't, for instance, have after the panel hearing, we couldn't then say to our membership, a decision will be made by such and such a date. It was quite open. The decision, when made, still leaves the dates open. So the whole question of the conditions of transfer and the process of purchase, there is no definitive statement as to when that will happen. I think along the way, a number of different issues arose. First, we felt that the ARPID officials who were also responsible for managing the field, to be fair, may have felt that they were protecting their turf or defending their turf. But in terms of how that relates to the requirements of the Act, i.e. having a fair, objective and sympathetic approach to communities, I have to say it just wasn't there. It felt like an uphill battle from a very early stage. The approach of the department could pretty much be defined as hostile rather than sympathetic. When the initial decision was made, despite the claims that it might threaten the scheme or threaten the cost of bull hire for the users of the scheme, no evidence was submitted. No evidence, financial or otherwise, was provided. So we made a freedom of information request, which essentially was about identifying the financial contribution of the field in the context of the finances of the scheme as a whole, the running costs of the scheme and farm. I don't know, but I suspect if we hadn't done so, it might have undermined our case considerably. And although presenting an ATR should be essentially about the positives, what benefits you hope to bring, there was clearly a need to try and preempt some of the things that ARPID might say. So there's an element there of using FOI legislation or any other source to try and ensure that the arguments that might be put by the public authority can be forestalled if that is appropriate. They claimed at the review panel that the cost to pool hire users would increase by 38%, but we already established that the net contribution of the field was 0.75% of the cost of running the scheme. So there's an awful lot of things that I could say about the process, but it would be, I'd rather sort of stick to general principles than get involved in the detail for those who weren't themselves involved. Difficult, needs a lot of patience, needs a lot of persistence. I think also needs a lot of continuity of personnel. Also elements of luck in terms of the knowledge and expertise of the people who that community has available to draw on and who happen to have the time to get involved. The intentions of the Community Empowerment Act may be good and positive, but I still think there are an awful lot of obstacles that need to be overcome by any community in taking this seriously. It is right and proper that publicly owned land is not handed over willy-nilly to anyone who wants it. There has to be a scrutiny scheme, but I think we did have resources from HI and DTAS, with a lot of support, a lot of positive support. But realistically, the resources available to any community as compared to the resources, in this case, available to the Scottish Government, are very heavily imbalanced, which makes it all the more important that the process be, I think, clarified and fair. And I think there are a lot of lessons for the Scottish Government in terms of how they define the process for dealing with any future ATRs. And my primary hope is obviously that we're successful, but also that nobody else in future has to go through something quite like this. Sorry, Maria, over to you.
Yeah, great. No, that was really good. And I think, as Gordon has said, we're still really waiting to hear the conditions. So we're not yet there. And, you know, the other thing I should say, just to add to what Gordon has said, that, you know, though we've had quite a challenge experience, you know, not all asset transfer are necessarily as challenging. But one of the good things is we are the first successful appeal from Scottish Government, so hopefully that will pave the way for others. And you know, just to add one further thought I had about, you know, the challenges. The other thing that is extremely difficult for communities is that you are expected to provide both a community benefits business plan funding, but without an asset, it's always very difficult, really. So you are, you know, not only don't you have there's an inequality in the resources, but in the quality in what you're expected to show. So just moving on a little bit to show. So I'm going to start with the sign, and I don't want to say very much, but just to show you a little bit about what the plans are. And we've worked with Harrison Stevens Architects and the community enterprise appointed as for us, helped us do some landscape designs, and that shows you the sort of first, the bigger picture shows some of the sort of space, the planning of the space, you know, making sure that it connects the network, the green networks connection, and the access routes are shown in there, and the sort of other picture on the other side shows a little bit about the plans there, and in terms of providing, you know, what the bigger square that is, the you know, the main allotment site. On this edge of it, you can see the space planned for area for walking and recreation, and then the area in the middle shows the orchard and the community hub bit with the car park on the corner the idea is very much to use a phased approach, and that will also enable us to build our capacity and funding. So very much focused on initially the development on the car park and the main allotment site, and then phased over a 10-year period the expansion of the allotments and the community growing space, which would be phase 2 and phase 3. So that's sort of in a bit of a quick overview of the plans, and we spent quite a lot of time developing the concept. And probably the idea within the next phase would be to look into some of this in a little bit more detail, to scope some of the specs required. And sorry, just moving. Let me just see if I can. So that again shows a little bit more about the plans, the allotment, you know, how the space divided, in terms of having a range of allotment sites. Some of them would be used by community groups. It will be different sizes. The idea being that you could have more experience, or people wanting just a little bit of land to be intermixed with those that are more experienced and want to grow more, having paths that are accessible. And the idea as well is that the community parking area would have some spaces for bikes and e-bikes. So being very much about active travel, being embedded in the concept from the start. And, you know, that's been a key part of our rationale for wanting that field, is a field that is still within easy access. So rather than allocating the land that nobody wants, or that's far away off town that people have to drive to, we want very much to use a site that's still in a key location to become that central hub of how our community, what our community can access. So very much about that 20-minute neighbourhood. How do you can do that in practice? It's sort of been inspired, driven quite a bit of the thinking behind the use of the space. So just a bit like Gordon was explaining, there is a lot of activity that goes, and it just shows you that this is about bringing people together as much as and creating a space that will bring those people together. And we already, just through organising visits and other events, there is very much quite a big demand from people to have that opportunity to have that space that they can use. I mean, that shows you, a community walk and cycle we did, and we did an apple grafting event and site visits we've done to orchards and other allotment sites, where there is a strong desire from people. In fact, quite a lot of our members are either driven by a desire to have an allotment themselves because they don't have access to land, or because they want to give back something to the community and they feel that they'd like to engage with others. And it's quite difficult to do that in an urban setting. So that's and then so bringing things to an end. Just one of the things is worth noting is that we have been quite privileged as well to have some help from DTAS, Highlands Alliance Enterprise, Community Land Scotland, other organisations that have supported us either through advice or encouragement. So that has been an important part of us being able to continue with that. And just on this sort of final slide, you can see as well, some of the publicity around the achievement of the appeal, which has been quite a big boost, and helping us sort of know that at least the principle of the community having the asset being allowed to progress with the asset transfer has been an important part of an important milestone for us for our next steps. So thank you. That's probably all that we want to cover.
Thank you very much, both to you, Maria, and to Gordon, for sharing your story so far. It's obviously the story we're not at a conclusion, but you've passed a significant stage, and obviously it's fascinating. I am sure the experience sounds also frustrating from you. Can I ask? Obviously, I think before we met, I surfaced particular interest around how communities who are experiencing deprivation and places that have socioeconomic challenges, and how they kind of participate in this form of community empowerment. Without shaming you, and it's obviously not shameful, but what's both your backgrounds outside of this, either before retirement or while where you're working just now, and I suppose your fellow trustees?
I mean, I can maybe start with, I've got a legal environmental background, and I work as an agriculture advisor as well. So quite it's been quite helpful to have that combination of skills. We have quite a range of skills. Gordon can, as particularly as well, quite a direct background, so that's been really helpful. And within our directors, we've got a GP, a sort of a business owner, sort of who is also a surveyor. I used to be a surveyor, a chartered surveyor before, and IT business member. One of our directors is a landscape gardener as well. So having that kind of range of experience, and Gordon, I'll let you say something about your own background. So quite good.
I've got an accounting background with a variety of roles in a whole range of different sectors. I had 7 years in housing associations before I ended up as what was it? Head of Finance and IT with the Crofting Commission. And up until 2012, the Crofting Commission was responsible for managing the bull scheme and the farms. So I had a fair amount of knowledge about the background. I should emphasise I only use publicly available information in this process.
But nonetheless, I mean, I think you referred to the fact that I think you said luck was involved in terms of the luck you had of the expertise. I mean, it's not just luck; it's you've come together as a group of individuals with the expertise, with a public benefit agenda together. But it is a high level of expertise, nonetheless, that you have as a group of trustees running an organisation. So, and that sounds like it's been crucial to being able to unpick some of the processes around the asset transfer process, particularly in getting through to the review level.
Yes, I think the advisors were very, very useful and very, very constructive in their inputs. But nonetheless, they are advising. At the end of the day, it's the community body that has to carry out the most of the work and see it through. And without that, it would be difficult for an organisation which didn't have a reasonable range of skills to go through that process. Not impossible, but difficult, definitely difficult.
And sorry, Maria, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, we've had to go through a review that has been, but even putting together the feasibility work, the fact that we sort of have, some of us have run projects, it's been quite helpful. So I think it can be quite challenging, even just without having to go through a review process. And I think that's maybe worth noting.
What would you say? I mean, obviously there's time. Aside from time, what have the costs been for Knocknagael to get to this stage?
I mean, we had a Scottish Land Fund grant of and it was a sort of relatively small amount, to 13,000. So, we've been quite lucky, but so that without that, we wouldn't have been able to do the feasibility work. Although that was a while back, so probably now you would need more funds to cover that kind of work. But Gordon, is there anything else you want to add as well?
The primary costs have been time rather than financial, but I think we're now entering into a stage where when you have a project up and running from the start date, there is every incentive for a lot of people to get involved, financially and otherwise. But when you're at the stage of trying to get it up and running, i.e. before there is something concrete, that's much more difficult. And we will be running into a stage where we will need legal advice, possibly accounting advice. And that it's that stage where, in order to keep this going to the point where the purchase is complete, we still have to do quite a lot of work, which may well involve a variety of financial outlays. And I suppose the uncertainty over that is the key issue. If you've got something concrete and say, we know we will have to fund X, then you can go out seeking funding for that. But when you're in a situation where you don't know what you may need funding for, and you don't know when you may need it, that becomes trickier.
Yes. I think you're making a very good point there. Any other questions from anybody else specifically about this project in Inverness? Nick, you've asked us a slightly white up. Sorry, I've got applause from Margaret. Do you have a question, Margaret?
Yeah, hi, I'm Margaret from Coburn Community Council. We have a much smaller project than the one that you are showing here today for allotments, community gardening. That we've already been told by the council that they have no interest in the land that we've identified. So our process is slightly, well, I'm hoping slightly easier than what you guys have gone through. With regards to your feasibility studies, your agricultural studies thing, how did you go about that? We are struggling at the moment to get to the next stage of, we've been asked to get soil samples and the agricultural landscape studies, but finding the right people to do the right things are the things that we're toiling with. Have you got any helpful information you could pass on?
I mean, I'm just thinking, I mean, in terms of the funding, possibly the Scottish Land Fund might be an option, because
the funding's actually okay for us because we're surrounded by wind farms, so we have access to a lot of funding. It's just actually finding who to approach to do the actual do the actual studies.
I mean, we're happy to get in touch about, some of the friendly approach, if that's helpful. But and also Ditas, it did help us with a list of contractors. So there is certainly a number of organisations, and the Federation of City Farms. So there's a couple of organisations they can maybe recommend people that we can send you as well details. Gordon?
I think Alistair, one of our members, one of our directors, works in gardening and landscaping and related areas, and he's one of these quite extraordinary people who seems to know somebody involved in just about everything. And I think he might be a very useful contact for you. And I wonder if we could pass Alistair's contact details on to you. If we can.
That would be fantastic.
Exchange contact details.
That would be fantastic. Thank you for that.
You can share it with us, and we can then share it with Margaret directly, or you can direct message the other in the meeting chat if you like as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's good to hear that someone has money but is looking for expertise. So it shows that whatever position you're in, there's possibly going to be a potential challenge. And I think Nick Wright's made a good point that, I mean, one of the reasons that we wanted this to be presented was because we think it's very interesting, the challenges that you've experienced, and as Nick has made the point that the more this kind of thing gets shared, and it's the difference between, as Karen and Gillian talked about, the difference between policy aspiration and the reality of achieving that either as a local authority or a community project. Nick, do you want to ask your slightly wider question, which might be for the whole room, not just for our speakers?
Yes. So it's this, I mean, I was picking up from what you didn't say, maybe, about perhaps the reasons behind the decision to refuse your initial request. It seemed to me that the ARPID people, the people who manage the farm, will be under a burden, a policy requirement to make the best value in their terms, and that would be selling it for housing. And so I can understand the rationale for them refusing, although it's not right. What I'm wondering is whether this, and then in Stewarton, we were looking at there, and Karen, I think it was saying, well, in order to make available a bit of land for community services, they had to, I can't remember, to negotiate with developers in order to allow them to put more houses in a particular area. It seemed to me like, there's a problem there, which is that developers have and current owners of land around towns and cities have an expectation of the value of that land, and it's all going to be built on that they're going to be able to make big profits. And we have this in Edinburgh. The whole of the greenbelt around Edinburgh is owned by developers, and it's very difficult to get access to any of that land for community use. And this isn't the way that it is in other countries. And I'm thinking of Germany. I think it is, where basically a lot of land is that's proposed for development is owned or taken under ownership by the state, and so the opportunity for land banking and developers making huge profits from buying land at agricultural prices and selling it as building land just isn't there, and so that means that there's more opportunity for community initiatives. Is that something that you feel might be more a widespread problem?
Yeah, if I can comment on that, one thing I'd say is, because we were quite involved, we sort of have to work through the planning system as well as the Community Empowerment Act, and one of the, I think even just looking at the current system, the Highland Inner Local Development Plan, although we've got a new plan that is supposed to be under the new framework that talks about place making, the process started before that came into place. So already, you are looking at planning for, the drive to plan is about a call for sites. So the zoning already is focused on developing rather than necessarily applying the placemaking principles. So I think it's about really being more rigorous in how we apply the principles, as much as the land ownership that needs to change. So I think there's a challenge that the first presentation made about how you retrofit, but also how we, looking forward, do we make sure that not every good piece of land is allocated just to housing? How do we change that? And I think there is a role for public organisations to lead by example. So it's really disappointing that the Scottish Government has failed to implement its own policies. So I think there is a need for local, for all public bodies to try and lead by example. That's my reflection on that. Aside from the ownership of land, which is, you can't resolve as easily, but it has to be through land reform processes like the community empowerment process we've followed. But Gordon, do you have any further thoughts on that?
Yes, I think the planning process was, which we were dealing with the planning process in parallel with this, and there's a whole big story around what that's involved. But essentially, the local community, insofar as I could tell, the local community objection to housing on that land was nothing to do with being against housing. It was about wanting more than housing. You can't create a community just by building houses. And although the field obviously has a green theme, in many ways I see it as potentially a big outdoor community centre. A focal point for a community that increasingly doesn't have a focus because of the emphasis on house building in isolation. So yes, I think there's a much bigger issue around this, and it goes back to how the local planning process progresses. At what point do the views of the community feed into the process? At what point do the issues about placemaking that we heard about earlier, is this a place people are happy to live in? What sorts of things do they miss? What would they like to see? And it seems to me that there are a plethora of organisations, big organisations, involved in driving this process, but all of which potentially individuals and therefore communities could feed into. But the overall impression is the process has overtaken purpose, and that it's much more a case of people feeling that things are being done to them, not for them. So yes, I think there are big questions around how the whole issue of placemaking and community planning, well, planning generally operates. And I really think we've got a substantial deficit in all of this.
And I suppose currently there's a consultation out on Democracy Matters, point 2, and looking at how we improve local democracy, which would feed into this particular agenda. Just before I go to Callum Duncan, who's got a comment on this, the best value issue, I remember it must have been about 2017 or 18 that I asked the then finance secretary around that desire for public bodies to seek best value, and if a community were looking for asset transfer, if the community benefits could outweigh higher financial value, and the answer was a completely uncaveated, of course, at that time, because they saw it as a wider, that whole place approach. But obviously the reality is that sort of community benefit focus is not transferring equally through all bits of government and local authority that have land ownership, where they also have budget pressures that they're seeking to. Currently, I mean, everyone wants some form of tax cut, from VAT to whatever it is, and obviously the government will need income so that they can continue to provide other services. So it's a really complex situation, but it would seem logical in delivering community benefits that projects such as this, it's very, very clear that the value or benefits that arise, which Community Land Scotland have been doing, have a paper currently out on as to how we kind of make that happen better. So yes, it is a universal problem. In answer to your question, Nick. Callum, you had a point to make on LDPs and housing allocation.
Yeah, thanks, Ewan. First of all, enormous sympathy for the frustration that you're going through in Inverness. It looks like a fantastic project, but this was actually a comment I had from the previous presentation, which I didn't want to make too fresh from your presentation, because it seemed like there were sort of more detailed issues around your concerns that were more governmental. But actually, now that you're talking about housing, in the first presentation, there was a comment made that the local authority is dictating how many houses need to be built for each local authority, and that was a fait accompli. There was no question, there was no part in the local place plan about what the need is or what the community feel. And this, if I can take Edinburgh as an example, I've been doing a bit of a dig around that. It's coming from the housing need and demand assessment, which is currently HNDA 3 for the Edinburgh area, just as an example. And that's saying Edinburgh needs 36 to 52,000 new homes between 2021 and 2040. Now, there's a waiting list of about 30 to 40,000 for affordable homes. So you could actually say, my little assessment here is about 24 to 35,000 of those needs to be affordable. So if it was the 35,000, you only need 1,000 market homes. I think that all towns, no matter whether population is declining or expanding, and I think I know Inverness is expanding. So that's not just about increasing population, that's people coming to Inverness from the wider area in the Highlands for work. There is an answer there to be considered about, well, rather than moving to the Inverness as a town, can we move jobs around the area? And there is a very relevant argument to be made from that. But I think every town and city is suffering from the quality of housing that is being built. And your example is an exact case in point where we're not looking at affordable homes being built in that, okay, there will be a minimum that has to be built if that were to be homes on that site, but actually it comes down to cost and price, and it's about market homes. And we're getting it all wrong because what we're doing is we're jumping to the conclusion that, say, for Edinburgh, we just need 50,000 homes of any type or variety. And that's not the case. It's potentially, we're also looking at the way that demographic is changing, and there's a whole host of finding homes that are appropriate for families, homes that are appropriate for elderly. And there's an enormous number of solutions out there, and there's a huge need to consult local people on this. But at the moment, we're stuck in this situation where housing need demand assessment says X, that turns into market-led homes of very poor quality being built. So it's not a comment, it's just, I think what we do need to do is to be asking questions about who is saying how many homes need to be built, what type of homes need to be built, and we shouldn't just be tied by that.
Maria, you have a response.
Yeah, no, and I mean, and I suspect this is an area where you could spend a lot of time speaking, and I suppose in the Inverness, you know, you sort of wonder, is it all about new land where the homes have to go? But I think the key thing for our project hasn't been, you know, we recognise that there is a need for housing, and you know, how you do that, you know, could be also be looking at you know, the existing provision we've got, how adequate are they? But I think it's just about creating that, future-proofing the spaces we live in. You know, we are talking about the increasing cost on the health system because of people not being able to move, having poorer lifestyles choices. We sort of food, we don't have, we're sort of losing all the good land we've got to the food we need. Some of the parts of the population don't have access to fresh food. So it's about trying to plan in a more integrated way for our needs in the future. And at the moment, the planning system is very much focused on, you know, housing by numbers, as you say, as well. You know, it all becomes an issue of, oh, well, we need 100 houses here, 100 houses in that bit, rather than thinking through how do we make sure we are creating spaces for the future. So I think that's where we sort of took the opportunity to pick one of the few places that are left that's still quite important to, still embedded in the community, to make sure we are future-proofing the city as a whole, and not losing all the good farmland we've got to you know, to concrete. So that's you know, I don't know whether that complements. Gordon, you might have another reflection on this. It's a good discussion, Callum. Thank you.
Yes, on the original draft local plan was amended to some extent, but it has still gone forward proposing this field and its neighbouring field for housing development. There were 50 responses to the draft local plan, 50 of which objected to housing on that field. And yet it has still gone forward. The proposal for housing has still gone forward and is now with the reporter. Now, presumably, in an ideal world, there would be a process whereby those 50 objections could somehow feed in at the start of the process, and therefore consider what an appropriate development of field might be in order to create place, create community, No, it only comes in at the end. And we still have no idea what weights the reporter might place on those objections. There's something wrong with the process.
Mm-hmm.
The provision of housing, it's obviously it's Poverty Action Week, and if you're members of Poverty Alliance, you may have been to some of their events. I was at their housing event yesterday morning, and the demand and need for social housing is incredibly high. As Callum has made the point, we're not delivering enough of it. The answer up to now has been to allow the market to kind of help supply that. But the messaging coming, I would say, from Crisis and SFHA and the like is that the market will not supply that, and that it needs to be the state that delivers that. And how and where the state delivers that is obviously important. And one of the reasons we invited Karen and Gillian to speak was because Karen is subject to, she has to deliver handout. That's her job. She has to deliver a housing target. But the work with ANDS was looking at, well, how do you deliver that in a more meaningful way for the whole settlement so that it's not just a bolt-on housing at the edge of it. But one of the things that Karen touched on in that was the local authority doesn't have any land. It has the leisure facility and it had the school estate. So it doesn't have space to deliver on. And the land that's privately owned, ownership trumps virtually everything. But we're obviously moving into a slightly different space with that, with the land ownership agenda. But I would say campaigners other than SURF would tell us that we're not progressing that either fast enough or meaningfully enough, so that we are delivering places that work coherently. And it looks like that will be an ongoing issue because it's a very difficult nettle to grasp politically. And I think one of the things that came up in the housing poverty agenda yesterday was the fact that people, even when it is social housing, people object to it being built. It can be higher densities, and there are, through the planning system, there are challenges to delivering that. Currently, something I find handled like a big game. I totally don't understand the housing demand numbers at all. I find it a really, really complicated thing to engage with, but it has a big impact on our communities, which is where our interest also lies.
I think, Ewan, if I can just make one point, we should be asking for, when just simply, we should be asking for that breakdown in any assessment of market-led and affordable homes, because at the moment it's just about numbers of homes, and you hear it on the news, BBC, you know, Scottish news, we need X number of houses. Well, what type of houses do we need?
I think the Scottish Government does have an affordable target, but most people would say that affordable target it's not social, and affordability is a very flexible word. I think it's 80% of market rate is what affordable is defined as, which for people who are in RSLs is not an affordable opportunity. So I think we need harder questions, I would agree, asked about what we're looking for in housing. It's now 12:16. We've overrun by 1 minute. Thank you very much to Maria and Gordon for presenting that, and obviously we wish you all the best with the next stages. We look forward to understanding what the conditions are of the sale, and that maybe doesn't take 2 more years for you to get satisfaction on that. And thank you very much to those who've contributed. There's been good chat in the column and some good links for people. Our next event will be a live event in November, and details of that will follow. It'll be looking specifically at the place standard in its various forms, and we're not sure whether it'll be Edinburgh or Glasgow, but it will be one of those places, and it will be, you'll all be invited to come to that, but details to follow. But other than that, have a very good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.